Income tax 2020. Tax software example. Other adjustments to income. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Here we are in our Lacerte tax software. You don't need the Lacerte tax software in order to follow along, although I do think they have a 30-day free trial, so if you can get access to it and have a demo version of it, you might want to do that. It's good practice software to be using. But we're going to be concentrating in on the Form 1040 and the related Schedule 1, jumping back and forth from the data input to the form so that we can run different scenarios, the tax software making it faster and easier for us to do so. We're going to be starting off with our starting point of the single tax filer for Eric Smith, living in Beverly Hills 90210, 100,000 on the W-2 income. Down below we have the standard deduction of the 12,400 to get us at the taxable income of the 87,600. Looking at that from our worksheet here, same kind of thing. 100,000 income, 12,400 standard deduction, bringing us on down to the taxable income, 87,600. Going back on over, we're going to take a look at Schedule 1. We're going to be concentrating in on the items related to the Part 2, which are the adjustments to income. We're going to be taking a look at the educator expenses. We're going to be taking a look at moving expenses for members of the armed forces. And we're going to be taking a look at the tuition and fees here and attaching Form 8917. Now, these are three deductions that you're not going to see as often, but you might get questions related to them. So we don't want to touch in on them a little bit. So first one, educator expenses. Now this is going to be a very specific deduction to a specific industry, those being teachers. So typically you're thinking if someone is going to be a teacher, typically being K through 12 type instructors particularly, then you want to think in your mind, okay, you might be able to pick up this educator expense. So it's going to be very specific by industry, which is a little bit unusual for like adjustments to income. I think it kind of exemplifies the power of the teachers union, if you're able to get an expense for your particular industry on the actual 1040 or Schedule 1. But it's a little bit older of a deduction, so it hasn't really been updated for the income or the value of money. So in other words, the value or the amount of the deduction has been static for some time, so it's not that high of a deduction at this point in time. And therefore, if someone is a teacher, it's most likely that they have, spent the amount of money necessary to basically qualify for the deduction, because it's only $250 for the deduction. That's their cap on it. So they're going to need to basically make sure that they save the receipts for $250,000 of purchases that they might make for business expenses, which would basically be for tools for education. And then you could take the deduction. And again, if someone's a full-time teacher, K through 12, then it's most likely that they, have those expenses. They would need to then be able to verify it in the case of an audit. So in that case, and if we put something in here like 1,000, it'll cap it, right? If I go back on over, then it's going to cap it at the 250. So 250 is going to be the cap, and then that'll roll down to the 250, and that'll then push on forward to the 1040. 1040, there it is on the 1040. Now, if they're married and you have two teachers, then of course it could be 500 because it'll be the 250 applied to the two educators. So it's 250, max per educator. Okay, so I'm going to jump back on over for that one. So it's fairly straightforward. Again, if you have someone, the big question typically is, do you qualify as a qualified instructor to take the credit? And then again, if they do, it's quite likely that they've paid more than $250 for education expenses, and they want to be able to verify that. But then most likely you can take the deduction in that case. Okay, then you have moving expenses for members of the armed forces. This is the one where it used to be that you had moving expenses for any change of job. So it was more likely that you would be using it. But remember, the armed forces is a very specific industry. Not only that, but they usually will compensate for the moving expenses in some way. So this one has been severely limited to the point where I'm not sure it's going to be applicable a lot of the time. You're not going to see it all the time, although you probably get questions of people moving, and you'll have to say, well, that law changed. You no longer get the moving expense unless it's for a member of the armed forces and you weren't reimbursed for it. But to take a look at it, we can jump to that one. We can say, let's jump to that. And I'm going to expand the form. There's going to be moving expenses. So let's go on into the moving expenses. And we basically have to say their armed forces move. It's a member of the armed forces. And then I'm going to say lodging and travel, excluding automobile And again, you might have situations with the auto expense and whatnot related to the moving expense here, as well as you calculate the expenses. But I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with it because, again, I don't think it's something that is going to be applicable a lot of the time. So if I go back on up, we're going to say we have the 1,000. So there's going to be the 1,000. I'm going to uncheck this. And we now have this form 3903. Let's do that one more time. Oh, this form's not available. It's not quite here yet. Sorry about that. So 3903 is not available at this point in time yet. But the detail related to that 1,000 would be on form 3903 and then flow on over to line 13. Of course, line 13 would then flow over to page 1 of the 1040, as we saw with the educator expense here. And there we have it. So I'm going to go back on over. I'm going to remove this now. So I'm going to remove this. I'm going to uncheck that and then go back on up to the forms. Now, like I say, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that moving expense because I don't think it's going to be applicable a lot of the time. And then we're going to go down to the tuition and fees deduction. This is form 8917. Again, this one we're not going to spend a lot of time on because you will usually be, if someone has tuition and fees, you'll typically get a form for it, and that will look like this, or it will have a 1098T tuition statement. Now, it might not look exactly like this, but you'll get it, have the same boxes related to it. And then when you get this, you're going to first be thinking not of the deduction, but the credits. This deduction is like number 3 of the list of things you want to do with this if you can have it. Typically, you want credit number 1, credit number 2, and then the deduction. So that's why it's not as useful to see it here on the deduction side of things, because that's not typically the field that you will be going to for it. So form 8917 is also not out at this point in time. So we'll take a look at the deduction for tuition or the credits for them in a future presentation when we go into the credits. So just want to note that this line, you might have questions about this line from students who they may ask you. They may say, hey, look, I have tuition fees. Why isn't it here on line 21? And you're going to say it's not there on line 21 because we took the credit, which you could find then on page 2 of the 1040, and we'll get into that in more detail in a future presentation. So again, these 3 deductions, like I say, educator expenses, very limited deduction, but as soon as you hear someone say, yeah, I'm a teacher, I'm K through 12, I'm a teacher, then you're going to say, you might get a $250 deduction there, and if they qualify as an educator, then they'll probably be okay to qualify for that. They need to have the evidence of the deduction, but like I say, it's a small, because the dollar amount hasn't changed over time since it started, it's a fairly low threshold of a dollar amount. And then again, the moving expenses is severely limited at this point. It may change next year. So you can have questions. People are going to say, hey, I moved for work. And you're going to say, well, that changed like 2 years ago. And that the way it is now, you don't get any deduction for the move, even though it's for work, unless it's for the armed forces. And even then, they would have had to not have reimbursed you for it. If they reimbursed you, then hopefully they took care of it, which they typically will do, in what I've seen on it at least, on the W-2. And then it'll be just easy for us to do the data input over here. We just got to enter the W-2 the way they have dealt with the moving expenses and the reimbursement of it. And then again, the tuition and fees, that of course we're looking for the credits first before we would take the deduction here. Only if the deduction gave a better tax benefit, which is typically not the case, would we take the deduction instead of the credit. The tax software will be very useful to help to determine which tax credit we can use for it and whether or not the deduction would provide more of a benefit, and in that case, take the deduction for it. So we'll oftentimes put the detail in the tax software, let the tax software do the calculations for us, and the determination of what the best place to be at will be for the tuition and fees.